Hey everyone, welcome back. I am here with the June Cards, Tags, and More kit. There are these beautiful watercolor papers, some plain white cardstock, a set of faux stitching tag dies. Just remember to be careful when you're pulling them off. Don't just, pull them up hard. But it does peel off. It peels off easy, but I wouldn't want to just yank one off and risk potentially bending it. Some Prima flowers, little Prima butterflies, a butterfly and flower stamp here, a couple of packs of jewels, and some seam binding. To start, I am going to take my paper and dies over and start getting some tags made up. All of these tags are what I was able to get out of just a single sheet of the white cardstock. So I have 4 of the largest ones, 4 of the second largest, 5 of the middle-sized ones, 4 of the next to smallest, and I believe 7 of the smallest tags out of a single sheet of cardstock. Now I'm going to make some die cuts of the pattern paper that was in the pack. So I was kind of sorting them. I wanted to see all of the colors, so I separated them since there's 2 of each sheet in there. So at first I started with just 4 of those pattern papers, more or less making a 12 by 12 sheet out of them. Then off I go to start making those die cuts. This is my first set out of those 4 sheets. I was close to having the same amount. When I have to take into the edges of those 6 by 6 sheets into consideration, I didn't get quite as many, but I did get very close to the same amount as my white tags. But then as I was cutting and I started thinking about the lines on the back, I decided to go back and get the other 2 prints that I hadn't already used, so that I could just cut more very specifically to have more of the lined papers showing. And now I have all of the tags cut out that I want to do right now. So if you're using the die cutter on the mat, you're going to want to make sure that your on there as perfectly as possible, since the whole 12 by 12 sheet is being used. Now for a manual cut, now this is just a piece of cardstock from my stash that I grabbed up just to use as my example sheet. You can print out those templates. Alright, on the printout I did make them to be 4 by 6 so that they would be easier to line up with the edges in the bottom of the paper. The first thing that you're going to want to do if you do print out these as templates, just cut out that slot on your printout so that you'll either be able to cut through it or make some marks with a thin pencil or something like that. You could try to keep them lined up, maybe tape them down in place with some artist's tape, maybe the repositional glue. I just like to do one layer at a time just so I don't have to worry about my template sliding on me. Now, you don't have to try and cut the circles. They are 1/8 inch. So if you have a 1/8 inch punch, you can just punch out lined up on those little the ends of the slot, and those are there so that there's a little bit more give in that slot, so there won't be tearing when you're getting your tags in and out of it. Okay, so with that all cut out, that template ready to go, line it up, get it straightened out, and I just use a fine pencil, a mechanical pencil there, and give myself some guidelines. Instead of trying to trace it all, I just give myself some guidelines to use for my ruler. And I do use a metal ruler just because I have had my craft knife catch and dig into rulers that have a plastic edge. So if you have a plastic ruler, just be mindful of that. And I just line my ruler up on my guidelines and carefully cut across where that opening is going to be. This, because it is a 12 by 12 sheet, is where if you have the Crocodile 2, you can punch much easier just because it allows for a deeper punch. So there you have it, a way to manually add your slots into your folio if you don't have an electronic cutting machine. I put the paper I'm using on my cutting mat with the part that will be folded inside down on the sticky surface, just in case there's any residue. When I am doing a manual cut, I flip the paper over so that I'm cutting through the backside. That way any marks that I do make, I won't have to worry about erasing them or whether they erase fully, because then they will just be folded inside when the folio gets folded up. Just like there, I just wrote marking and cutting on the side that would be folded inside. Now for the score lines. Very simple. A score line at 4 inches and 8 inches for the main sections there, and then rotate 90 degrees and add a score line at the 6-inch mark. So now you see what I meant by the part that's folded inside. Once it's all together, you won't even know the marks are in there, and you can see that, like my manual one now, with it folded up, that single slot page is the 3rd section. So now I'm going to go back and just work on the one that I am going to be using for the completed project. And then on this one, instead of trimming right now, I don't know if I will trim or not, I'm just putting a score at the 1/2 inch mark above where the barcode and names are on that sheet. I would have done this originally. I forgot that I had made allowances just to have a little bit of extra bend. They're only 1/2 inch total, so I go out 1/4 inch to the left and 1/4 inch to the right and add a couple more score lines next to those score lines that are at the 4 and 8 inch mark. And there you have it. My base is ready for the next step, which we'll be working on the little inside pockets. While I was waiting for my pockets to cut out, I decided to finally take this moment to switch out my Tim Holtz mat. I have all of the different sized pockets cut out. I do use some of my own white cardstock in this project just because I was making a lot of different example cuts. So if some of them seem like not exactly the same color, it was probably from one of my own sheets. As you can see, I have a lot of different pockets. I do have the measurements up on the blog. They're labeled so the slots line up and the pockets fit. So if you don't have an electronic cutting machine and you're going to be cutting these out by hand, they're all the same width. I think I have them at 3¼ inches. I don't actually remember right offhand right now. I've done so many measurements, but you can just print them out and make templates to line up your slots on them. You don't need to use a scoreboard. I do have them measured so that they should just be able to be folded in half and they will fit in their designated areas. There's a couple might have to be folded slightly more than half, but you can just do that and kind of adjust once you have them in your folio, depending on exactly how you have your margins around your edges. So all of them just like that, made to fold in half. You can use a scoreboard, you can do it by hand. I did just this one on the scoreboard. The rest I just did by hand. They're on the inside, so whether your creases are absolutely perfect or not is not necessary. This side, easy enough. I only have one tag slot in there in the center, so there's just this one. You can see this is one of the ones that once I had it attached, I just folded it up just a little bit more. Easy fix, doesn't have to be perfect, gives a little bit of wiggle room. That one I was just showing, if you didn't want to take the time to make a full folded pocket with a reinforcement slot on it, you could just take a rectangle of cardstock and glue it around the four sides and just sort of make a backing for your little slots to make little pockets like that. I have my pockets like this because I do want the extra layers to reinforce that opening. You can use whatever adhesives you have and are comfortable with, double-sided tapes, Scotch tape glider, art glitter glue, the tacky glues, PVA glues, anything that's appropriate for paper to paper adhesion. I like using a combination personally, just because I think it adds some extra strength. So I do use a combination of double-sided tape and art glitter glue. This is 1/4 inch double-sided tape, and I line it up just above the tops of the holes on the top and just below them on the bottom, just to get a nice seal at that opening. So to start, I just go through, I add my double-sided tape just to kind of speed up the process instead of doing totally one pocket at a time. I'm just going to go over this pocket step by step because I do them all the same. So after I have my double-sided tape on, I come in and draw a very fine line with my art glitter glue around the edges so that it will be sealed completely, so I don't have any gaps or areas that can be snagged up. And then I just come in here and line up my two slots. I do not push it down all the way until I have a chance to hold it up, flip it over, and make sure that everything is lined up where I want it. Which is also the benefit of using a liquid glue with double-sided tape, because that liquid glue will allow for a little bit of extra movement on top of double-sided tape before everything gets pushed together. Then I just come through. My fingernail right there worked just fine on removing any excess glue that had squeezed out into my slot. Like I said, this one here, I just folded it up just a little bit more. because it was a little past where I wanted it to be, but I wasn't too worried about it. It's an easy enough fix. It's an internal pocket. Now for folding up and closing my pockets. This is some 1/8 inch double-sided tape that I very carefully line up along those edges. You don't need to use double-sided tape here. I'm sure I could have done perfectly fine with just some glue, but I have a philosophy that there's no such thing as too much adhesive. Sometimes that backfires on me, but I like to make sure that things stay where I put them. Okay, so before I added my glue, I had started trying to add it, and then I remembered I may want to make sure the top stays closed. So I came back in and I just added, for this pocket I added 2 strips of 1/4 inch double-sided tape. For most of my pockets I only needed 1. I just added the extra because this had the little bit of extra fold up. And then I come in, same as when I put the slots together, I add some art glitter glue. That helps because the art glitter glue dries fully. It helps seal against the edge of that double-sided tape, so there isn't I don't have to worry about a sticky edge. It does just help fill in any gaps and really just make sure that everything's gonna stay put. And when I do these edges and I say I put a fine line down, I put a very, very fine line down exactly along the edge of my 1/8 inch tape there. And then I just add a little bit extra on the tape. And then I do the same thing for the top of the pocket. Then all that's left is folding it up, grabbing my bone folder, and really making sure that those edges are sealed up. And then you can use your bone folder, one of the tags, to just make sure that there isn't any glue you may not have noticed that would stick your paper together where you don't want it. Now I'm going to go over different options. I do have the measurements for all of these different options. There is the one option here where you can have a separate pocket for each slot. I have one where it is one lawn pocket. All you have to do is make sure that at each slot seal up against the paper so there aren't any gaps. I have cuts for making a combination pocket for the bottom 2 slots of the 3 slot panel with a pocket, separate pocket for the top slot, and I have one to make the top 2 slots a single pocket with a separate pocket for the bottom shorter slot. So different combinations, whichever one that you think will work best for what you want. For the panel that has 2 slots, I have a cut where you can turn both slots into a single combined pocket, or you can make 2 separate pockets, one for the top slot, one for the bottom slot. In the end, I make a separate pocket for each slot, so I do have a total of 6 pockets on my finished one, and this is one of the main reasons why I'm gonna kind of try to show you with just kind of holding it together. If you do make everything a single pocket, then your top pockets will show up in your bottom pockets through the little, I mean, it's not a big show, but when you have separate pockets, then they just sort of disappear when they go into their respective pockets, so they don't show up in any lower slots. Alright, so I'm just going to finish up my pockets, working from the bottom up on the other two panels, and be right back. I have all of my pockets in place, and I have just used some of my 1/4" double-sided tape to go around the entire thing. I did leave my little flap there. I have double-sided tape on it, just to help protect the bottoms of those pockets when I fold everything up. Sort of a little pocket for the ends of those pockets. So now I want to add my closure, and I am just going to use the seam binding, well, part of the seam binding for this. So when I add the seam binding, because this is a tri-fold folio, I am going to want that seam binding to come out part way across at the spine that is between the second and third panel. It's 1/2" seam binding. I measured up 3 inches and just made a couple little marks to help me line up my seam binding. So now with that little slot, which I just cut through real carefully with my craft knife, so with that little slot, when everything is folded up, I will be able to tie it closed. I'm just trying to kind of get the seam binding so that the ends hanging off are about the same length. So I was just kind of measuring from where it came out of this spine to the end of it, so that I can have about the same amount coming off the other side. I'm just using some 1/4" double-sided tape just to hold it in place and keep it from sliding around while I continue putting the rest of the folio together. I don't put my double-sided tape in the spines. I don't really want to keep adding layers to where all my bends are, but for this I just kind of want the double-sided tape to help hold my seam binding in place, with a little bit of glue to go in with it. To work on the end of the seam binding that comes out of the edge here, I just peeled up the backing on my double-sided tape so that I could feed it through while I worked with everything and kind of tried to work out where I would be going as my next step. I wanted to add some color to my inside hinge area, to the inside folds. I didn't want it too thick. I wanted to add a little bit of layering on the inside, especially where I have the tie coming out of that slot, so the slot has more layers and would be less likely to maybe tear. But I couldn't figure out what I had that was thin enough. I had originally thought of using some of the pattern paper from the kit, but I didn't want to use something that thick. So as I I was just hanging on to that paper pack and trying to brainstorm what to do, I noticed the cover sheet, which has that section that has all of the different color blocks on it that is in the pack, and it is very thin, like printer paper thin. So the parts that have writing on it, I used for the inside stabilization. I couldn't quite decide what I wanted to do to hold it in place, so I used 1/4 inch double-sided tape and carefully put it in between the score lines where there will be folding, and then added a little bit of glue just to hold that in place. Added some extra glue to the slot just to give it a nice seal, and cleaned up any excess that goes out of the slot so it wouldn't make that seam binding stiff. For the 2 strips of that cover sheet that I'm using on the inside, I cut them 1 inch wide, and I just used 1 inch double-sided tape on them to put them in place until I get ready to finish the inside. At this point in time, I didn't know exactly how I would be finishing up the inside. I just wanted these pieces to be in place so that I could have the majority of the base construction finished, so that I would be able to close it up, get it sealed up, and let all of the glue dry. I wanted to add a little extra strength to the end of the seam binding that comes out of the edge of the front cover. You can use some eyelets, you can use some brads, you could throw in a couple of stitches. You don't have to add anything if you don't want to. I just really wanted to make sure that it stayed put, and being tied wouldn't stretch it out too much or have it tear paper or anything like that. In the end, what I did decide on is to staple it in place. I made sure the bottoms of the staple would be the part that was folded in, so that the tops of the staple would be on the surface and be able to maintain a smoother finish. So after I had my staples in, I wanted to make sure that I got everything as flat as possible. So I grabbed up my bone folder and I really just kind of pushed that staple down, worked out the curves from the bottom as much as I could, just so I would have a smooth of a finish as possible. All of my main pieces are in place, and now I am ready to get the edges sealed up and start my work on the decorating. I just peel off the backings of my double-sided tape all the way around, add in some glue, and really push it down, make sure everything's sealed up, and let that glue dry. Alright, with my main base dry, I am ready to just add in the last little bit of seam binding on the outside of the hinges. I just really wanted to make sure that those hinges, because they are cardstock, will just have some extra strength and stability for opening and closing. The first thing I did was just fold one of them in half so that I could make a slot for the tie to feed through. For the outside hinges, I used my 1/8 inch double-sided tape. I let it go off the ends a little bit, just so that when I trimmed down the seam binding, it would help keep it from fraying. I also have a little bit of glue to help hold it in place, but the double-sided tape isn't necessary. I do, however, think that it helps keep pieces in place while you wait for your liquid glue to dry. Once again, I went in between the bend marks so that the double-sided tape wouldn't be on the folds, and I just added that to both of them, added my glue, and put my seam binding down in place, and then let that dry. If you want to sort of shave off that inner flap so that you have a smoother closure, after it was all put together is when I decided to take it over to my paper cutter. And when I say I shaved it off, I did maybe a 1/16 of an inch at a time. I only have about an 1/8 of an inch total taken off, just enough to not really make a visual difference, but to allow a little bit of a smoother closing.